Yeah. Uh, SV has also joined us. Okay. Uh, so, can we begin? Let me begin by introducing Dr. Sambaya Gundimeda. Dr. Sambaya Gundimeda is faculty at the Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. He is interested in Indian political processes, caste, religion, and multiculturalism. Prior to joining his current position at Azim Premji University, he worked at the Council for Social Development, Hyderabad, as an assistant professor and as an associate fellow at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, New Delhi. In 2002, he secured a Ford Foundation International Fellowship to pursue his PhD in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS, University of London. He was awarded with a Charles Wallace India Trust Visiting Fellowship to work on his book manuscript at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, University of Edinburgh. Between 2015 and 17, he was a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. He has many publications in international peer-reviewed journals, as also a book by an international publisher. Thank you so much, Sam, for suggesting this film and also for initiating the discussion today. Welcome to Talking Films Online. And over to you.
Thank you, Nikhila. Can you hear me, right? You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Great, great.
Yeah.
So good evening, friends. Again, thank you, Nikhila, for this, and the friends who are, involved in Talking Films online platform for this wonderful opportunity. In fact, I've been learning a great deal by taking, part in this, discussions. Um, you know, it's actually kind of providing great insights into like how to understand the film, documents and so on. Really grateful, the platform for that. So let me, begin my, our discussion by a point. My son actually made, very recently. He has been along with me. He watches Telugu films. So this is something that he has to say. So Telugu cinema is all about a man trying for a girlfriend, and other people going against that man because of that girl. I think this boy is 7 years old, but I think he captured some essence of some pictures, definitely. But today I want to kind of go beyond that, the framework, the idea of my sons. I want to kind of share different viewpoints, in the sense like how the politics, and then there's a connection between this real life and then real life. I'm hoping to kind of learn a great deal from now. As we also joined, I've been kind of reading his book, on a Telugu film. So wonderful opportunity. I'm looking forward for all your insights into this talk and then discussions. Now the story, I'm sure, like you got it. I don't have to kind of tell again, but very quickly, it's the story of a billionaire son. He's a despite kind of super rich person by any standard. He's a down to earth person, generous, helping each other, helping people, whenever they need it. Very concerned about whom we kind of think other people also, like part of the extended family and so on. So he doesn't want to kind of piggyback upon his father's money. Rather he wants to kind of earn some respect for himself on his own.
Sam, sorry to interrupt. Just let me know at what point I should share the slides.
Oh, I see. You can start, Nikhila. I'm so sorry. I mean, I thought the second slide.
Okay.
Yeah, start with the first slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will.
Okay. Yeah. And then second one also I gone through. Yeah, great. The first one, the second one, I have some difficulty in kind of making this in PowerPoint because my system difficulties. I requested Nicola to make present the slides. Thank you, Nicola. Let's go for this third one. The story.
Yeah.
Third slide. Yeah. So informed by about his kind of village, or his father's village, by his girlfriend, that he is set to kind of go to set to take undertake a journey to visit his father's village, Devarkota, which is kind of located in Uttarandhra, north coastal Andhra, north coastal Andhra. Then there to his nature characteristic features that he's kind of moved by the villagers sufferings, and so he wanted to do something about it. And also before that, as he learned some of the rural development technologies or techniques, strategies that he tried to kind of implement that through that. In the process, he adopts the village, right? Then obviously, not obviously, because of his developmental activities, he had to kind of confront with the already people who are established and who kind of hold political power in that locality, particularly from that village. And then he because he was sort of developing that village, he want to see that it develops in all respects. So he goes against the established forces, dominant forces of obstructing their liquor business, and then going against their the project of land grabbing and so on. So and then eventually, like any typical Telugu film, hero succeeds in his endeavors, in his efforts. So this man eliminated at the end, eliminates villains, and then save the village from disappearing, and then he the lands of the farmers of that village kind of secure up, they kind of able to kind of retain their lands with them. Okay. So Nicola, could you move on to the next slide, please? Basically, through this presentation or discussion, I want to kind of look at I'm not a kind of cultural student, or somebody kind of who had kind of an expertise knowledge or kind of understanding and then reading films, but this is sort of coming from this my own political science background, and then also from my own social location, that I'm trying to kind of understand this film. So these are kind of my thoughts. So basically, I want to kind of focus upon three areas. One is upon this village development, and then also the idea of village adoption. Okay, and then the means to achieve the ends, basically the violence as a kind of method, in securing everything. So I just wanted to kind of share my views on that. So by the time Srimantudu Harsha, this man hero Mahesh Babu, reaches Devarkota village, the system of the state there in that village disrupted, or better still destroyed by Venkatratnam family, both Venkatratnam and then his brother Shashi. Venkatratnam was kind of local MP and so on. Now Srimantudu Harsha, he rebuilds the destroyed village through acts like laying up tar roads, rebuilding schools and hospital, and then also like providing water facilities and so on. And then through that, while doing that, he also enters into conflict with Venkatatnam and his family members, who have been appropriating government funds, meant to development of the village. They occupied this village lake, the only water resource for the entire village, and then they forcefully taking away lands from the village farmers and so on. These are the we get to know. Now, what are the consequences of this charitable acts of Srimantudu Harsha? Obviously, for me, there is a positive side to these acts, such as yeah, such as kind of restoration of school building, hospital, road laying, centralized water supply system, restoring lands to the farmers and so on. But there is negative side also, which to my mind is an important aspect. Here my claim is that while Venkatratnam and company, destroys the state system in the village through their Gundaism, Srimantudu Harsha doing the same through his charity, or what I would like to kind of call it, killing with kindness. Once the state system is destroyed, what is there for the villagers in that village, where and whom would they want to kind of go in case for further repairs, whom they would approach actually. So if they want to require medicine in the hospitals, and in the event of conflict between individuals and communities, who would adjudicate their problems? Obviously, they would like they would look at Srimantudu Harsha or some other people to find a solution to their problems, right? This in turn leads to hero worship, or hero worship, and then losing of their own agency. It's basically people themselves participating in the destroying the system, and also losing their own agency. Then I mean in turn losing their self-respect that they could do rather than depending upon any other person. Okay, and then that process it also leads to hero worship, which is against the very foundation of democracy, both as a system and value. But the question is, how long these affluent individuals go on supporting the villagers? Another important question here is, what is the point in having state and its institutions, basically? Nikhila, could you kind of move on to the slide? Not that. Could you move further, please?
Next one.
Yeah, next one, and then after this, water tank. Yeah, next one, please.
This?
So yeah, please, thank you. So after this film got released, and then lots of politicians, and then bureaucrats, police people, and so on, several people actually began to adopt the village. In fact, I want to kind of I was kind of interested in this film in understanding, simply because the various political people kind of the way they've taken forward this idea. For instance, if you look at that time, Andhra Pradesh was kind of ruled by Chandrababu Naidu's government. He said, he tweeted, in fact, great movie on giving back to society. Then Telangana, K. Chandrasekhar Rao's son, KTR, or K. Tarak Rama Rao. So he mentioned, on the eve of Gramajyoti, Srimantudu is a fabulous movie to catch. Focus on rural development and the social responsibility is a great idea. Then if you look at Mahesh Babu himself, actually, Srimantudu hero, he adopted Bujipalam, his father's own village in Tenali region in Andhra Pradesh, and he also adopted another village in Mahabub Nagar district in Telangana, which is kind of Siddhapuram village. This is kind of interesting. It appears he was requested, to do so by KTR himself. Following that suggestion, actually, it seems, he adopted that village also, both in Telangana, and then not to kind of, do any injustice to, other Telugu states and so on. Then his brother-in-law, Galla Jaydev, could you move on to the next slide, please? Galla Jaydev, who is also member of, parliament from, Guntur parliamentary constituency, adopted, Anantavaram village in Guntur district. Mahesh Babu's sister, and Galla Jaydev's wife, Padmavati, also adopted, Kanchalapalam village near Tenali. So, a number of other rich people, politicians, also adopted several villages across the country. Now, I have a set of questions. I hope we will have some discussion on this front. What is this adoption business all about? In my understanding, forgive me, if that's not kind of at a high level, but traditionally the idea of an adoption relates to the childless couple taking responsibility of raising a child, or an orphan child is being looked after by a well-off couple, and so on. Now, our villages in India became orphaned. I mean, whose responsibility is the development of village? Why the governments are encouraging private individuals to adopt villages? Such encouragement, I mean, is it lack of money with the government, or lack of will, or there is a certain hidden or ulterior motive towards that? Those billionaires. Nicola, could you go to the next slide, please? Those billionaires who are adopting the village, why can't they give the money to the government to undertake developmental activities in the villages? I mean, if they do not wish to give money to the government, why can't they work with the government rather than working separately for the same cause? I mean, if they think that government's rural development schemes are failed, then what master plans, these billionaires have for the village developments? I mean, these are the questions that need to be posed, and certainly, people deserve some response from those people that adopt villages. To my mind, the village adoption, at least by the politicians, is a political strategy. Obviously, when politicians adopt a certain village, they will earn the respect and affection of the villagers, right? So, and when they contest in the elections, that respect and affection of the villagers will be translated into the vote bank. So, I mean, in the sense, like, it is a kind of long-term planned, planned out vote bank strategy, right? If you look at this guy Mahesh Babu's brother-in-law, Galla Jaydev, director of this Amar Raja company. This man actually not from Guntur. He came from somewhere in the Rayalaseema region. His mother and then father, basically coming from this political background. So, and then the way he kind of contested and then won the elections in Guntur district. Obviously, people like Krishna and the Mahesh Babu and then other Kammas actually kind of helped him to kind of win the election, Telugudesam, through Telugudesam party. So I mean, this is sort of what I'm trying to say, that this village adoption is kind of for, especially by these politicians, it's a sort of vote bank politics. Another point is that all the villages in India required infrastructure development and schemes for the socio-economic, cultural and political development of the villages, right? All the villages, irrespective of like maybe kind of adopting one or two villages, but all the villages required same kind of infrastructure and then schemes for this the development of the villages as such, right? In any parliamentary constituency, there will be nearly hundreds of villages, right? All these villages might have voted for their MP, expecting he or she would develop their village. But by simply adopting one village in the entire constituency or two villages in the entire constituency, what kind of message that MP is giving? with due respect, Prime Minister of this country also adopted, a village in Uttar Pradesh. Why only one village? Is he Prime Minister of, that village or the entire country? Why can't he distribute funds equally to all the villages, in India? You know, now, so could you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. Now, either in the Srimantudu film, or those billionaires, who adopted, villages, or even the Prime Minister, there is no discussion about, land question. The other point, land is the, key, resource through which, any doors can open in any village, right? While the upper caste dominate the village through their control and the ownership of land and then other resources, the marginalized, or, generation together suppressed on account of lack of land in their, hands. This is something that, I'm sure, like, this guy, Koratala Shiva, who's the director of this film, like, he knew, he's aware of that. And actually he come from this, coming from communist background. But, there was no discussion as such, land distribution as such. It's kind of, securing, protecting the lands, of the farmers. Then, I want to kind of, move on to my last point, which is sort of, the, violence as the means, but question is kind of, can ends justify the means, so if you look at, throughout the film, there are 7 instances, where the protagonists confronts either with the, henchmen of the villains or the villains themselves, the central minister Venkatatnam, his son Radha, and his brother, Shashi. Could you move on to the next slide, please? The first confrontation between the protagonist and the, goons, taking place at, the leading lady character, Charusila's, friend's wedding reception, right? The central minister, sends these goons to teach the protagonist, a lesson as he kind of, dare to warn him at his official residence in Delhi. Approximately 7 to 10, gundas actually enter the function to beat the protagonist. The hero realized this, and he straight away goes to the leader of the gang and asks him whether they were there on behalf of the minister. When the gang leader affirms it, then the protagonist tells him to collect his gang and leave the place immediately, since it is not proper to spoil the wedding reception. 2 aspects may be noted here is that the protagonist's intelligence, in discerning the, that the goons were sent by minister, and a sharp eye to recognize the leader of the gang, right? And the protagonist's concern for propriety. That is, it is, important, improper to spoil, someone's kind of, wedding, which is, when the protagonist, realized that the gang leader is, hell-bent on, trash him, he decides to fight against the gang. But he did not forget the impropriety of, fight in a function. Therefore, he put all the goons down very, silently and skillfully without, anybody, noticing. So at the end of the fight, the hero tells the gang leader that in the future, if they want to fight with him, that they should kind of arrange it in a better place so that, they can finish, he can finish it, in a flow without any constraints. The statement of the protagonist reflects his self-confidence and, a complete belief in his abilities. Now, could you move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, the second instance of violence takes place, during the protagonist's, birth journey from Hyderabad to Devarkota village, the village wherein his family roots lies. The protagonist, got up from the bus as some vehicles were kind of, blocking the way. He spots the group of people, who are, in agitated mood and whose vehicles were kind of, blocking the path, and asks them to remove the vehicle. Right? It's an interesting to note here that though, the earlier instance, particularly the protagonist, dealing with the central minister and his family, knocking down goons at, wedding reception, and winning the highway contract to his, father's company, earlier kind of, we have seen that, how he managed to kind of successfully kind of, won the contract, despite kind of, his own family member actually, given him a tip to the other opposite people. The audience informed about his intelligence and, sharpness, right? Through the incident of 20 lakh donation to an employee's wedding, we were also informed about the hero's generosity and concern for others. Looking through these given impressions, one would kind of be surprised to see that the hero did not reach to the incident of outrage in front of his own eyes, where two people were kind of jostled by this villains gangs. But once the protagonists realized that the goons were kind of belong to the minister and his son are also present at the scene, the protagonist decided to kind of interfere in the situation, both on account of the two victims and also on behalf of the waiting passengers in the bus. In other words, the hero decides to confront the goons for the benefit of others, to save time to the bus passengers and protect the lives of the two victims. Could you move on to the next slide, please? The third instance of violence, which is rather low in scale, takes place in Devarkota village center. On his way back home, along with friends, from a film theater, the protagonist notices the presence of an open liquor shop. Right, several villagers, sat in front of the makeshift shop and consuming liquor. His sight angers the protagonist and demands the liquor sellers to remove the shop. When the shopkeeper did not kind of heed to the protagonist's demand, the later smashes of the liquor bottles. It was at this point, one of the henchmen of Shashi shouts at hero, for daring to touch the product belong to Shashi, and he should kind of destroy the product. He should destroy the product if he does not want to kind of live in the village. That's kind of a warning. The protagonist was daunted by this henchman's threats. Indeed, he hits the later rather harshly. Frightened by the protagonist's daringness, the henchman flees the locality by taking along with him the products and his friends. For a protagonist, the liquor is dirt, chatta, that adds to the already spoiled environment of the village. From that angle, the liquor sellers are messing up with the protagonist's efforts at cleansing the village. As such, while the beating up of the goons were considered or justified as a form of punishment for their act, the act of vandalism or damaging the liquor products by the protagonist, justified on account of the common good, right, that he was trying to kind of achieve in the village. Now, could you move on to the next slide, please? The fourth incidence of violence between the protagonist and the goons of villains on account of Sumati, a hapless widow. Sumati's husband, who was kind of born and brought up in Devarkota village, he dies off while serving in Indian Army. He was survived by wife and two children and his parents. While the children are very young, the parents or elderly. Therefore, the running of the household has kind of fell upon the shoulders of Sumati, who now became a widow. The government contributes some money, with the contributed money. She sort of bought up a portion of land, and then by cultivating some vegetables and so on, and is kind of living on that. So now that in other words, the 1 acre agricultural field is the only source of livelihood for the entire family, whatever she bought. The very source of livelihood threatened to be taken away from their hands. As Venkatatnam and his brother wanted that land and others' lands in the village, either by hook or crook for their upcoming business project, right? Sumati informs the protagonist about the nefarious scheme of the villain brothers and their henchmen, who threatens her for the land documents, right? Now, when the henchmen arrived at Sumati's house to collect her signature and documents, the Srimantulu Harsha The protagonist asks them to be sympathetic with her situation, both on account of her deceased husband, who grew up along with them in the same village, and the courageous way in which she has been kind of supporting her family without expecting any help from anyone in the village. It was when the miscreant turned deaf ear to the protagonist's plea and continued to insist upon the lady's signature, that the protagonist it appears left with no choice but to knock down the goons. What is important for our discussion is that the protagonist had to resort to violence to protect the property of a helpless woman and her family. Now, could you move on to the next slide, please? Now, the fifth incidence of violence, occurs between this, protagonist and the villains inside the, villains, mango estate at Devarkota village. Over the course of the film, the audience get to understand that whoever challenges the authority or question the criminal activities of the villain brothers or villain's family, those people kind of forcefully brought to this estate. It is also understood that such people, the day that they were kind of brought into this estate would be the last day of their life. The protagonists meddling in their land grabbing activities enraged the villains. They could not swallow that someone who came from outside had the guts to hit their own men. They felt it is an affront to their power in their own citadel. In their book of rules of power, the offender must pay with his life, right? As the audience were told, Shashi goes to Narayan Rao's house to capture Harsha. As he could not find the Srimantulu there, he grabs Charu by telling Narayan Rao's family that if they want their daughter back, then they should send Harsha to the mango orchard. Narayan Rao's fears for Harsha's life, as he knew what happens in mango orchard. Therefore, as soon as Harsha comes back home, he asks him to kind of to pack his luggage and leave the village immediately. He was more concerned for a protagonist's life than the security of his own daughter. Through the earlier deeds of the protagonist, the audience would have kind of guessed that he was not the person who gives a damn about these threats of villains. But when he came to know about Charu's abduction and the condition of her release, he decided to go to the orchard. Right? At the orchard, the protagonist tells the villains that there was no need for the girls' abduction. As he would kind of have come had they send the word. But the protagonist's purpose of coming down to the mango orchard was more than that of rescuing Charu. He was he has been kind of gathering information pertaining to villain brothers misdeeds, the government's funds, the misappropriation of government funds, and so on. The money that that they swindled in various government schemes that ran into hundreds of crores, and then the killing of more than 50 people who confronted them, and the occupation of lake that meant to provide water for irrigation for 11 villages across around this Devarkota village. So they were told to return all that money and looking after the families of the people who were killed by them, and restoring the lake to the villages. Now it may be noted here that if one were to think through the prism of state and its legality, all the misdeeds of the villain brothers constitute criminal offense, and they were proven guilty, then the punishment would have been either a death penalty or life imprisonment and so on. But for the protagonist, the existence of state and its legal system appears to be a matter of it doesn't matter at all. For he was not asking the villains to surrender before the law, but simply asking them to kind of return whatever they have had misappropriated. Suggestion of looking after the members of the murdered appears to be a noble one, right? But one wonders whether such support is kind of acceptable to the members of the deceased. While these aspects, deserve a lengthy discussion, for the current purpose, however, it is suffice to say that, the imagined justice of the protagonists is in contravention with the justice of state. You know, that this aside, and to get back to our point of discussion, the protagonists, demand returning the state funds, restoring the lake to the villagers, and support to the bereaved family members is made on behalf of others, right? As expected, the villains did not agree with such a proposal, and so the violence seemed to be, inevitable. Interestingly, the protagonist's violence, in the Mango Orchard, episode is justified not on account of, on one count, but upon three, protecting Charu, self-defense, and facilitate as a facilitator of justice. Then could you move on to the next slide, please? The sixth instance of violence, I think I missed one slide here, but that's okay. The sixth instance of violence takes place between the protagonists, and the villains and henchmen on account of the lake, right? We have mentioned that this is the kind of only source of water, irrigation facility for Devarkonda and another surrounding villages. The lake had been occupied by villain brothers, and water is diverted, to their distillery factory. This means the agriculture upon which all those 11 villages depend upon has been badly affected. In the first half of the film, the audience were shown how a farmer was driven to commit suicide by consuming pesticide, as he could not undertake any agriculture due to lack of water. The audience were also shown the migration of farmer's widow along with her two children on account of the death of the main breadwinner, and the remote possibility of any improvement in agriculture. Right? The protagonists, along with his village friends, decided to set the things correct by diverting the water from the lake to the agricultural fields. When the villain brothers came to know about this diversion, they sent a bunch of goons against the protagonist and his friends. To cut this short, in the combat between this villain's goons and the protagonist and his friends, while all the friends are brutally killed, the protagonist survived, the stabbing. Now, the final incident, the last slide, Nikhila, thank you. The final instance of violence between the protagonist and the villains and their henchmen at the distill that belongs to the villains. After the attack against the protagonist, he was forced to leave the village both by his own family and his love, Charu, and her father Narayan Rao, right? After the protagonist's departure, the villains once again have had become an unquestionable and unstoppable force. Earlier they were kind of unstoppable forces, but after Srimantri entered village, they kind of they had to kind of suffer a setback. But once he kind of left the village, then there's no stop for them. The farmers were coerced into handing over their land documents for a small pittance. Even Narayan Rao, the elder of the village, was also forced to hand over his land documents. At the end, the villains have succeeded, in gathering 6,000 acres of land. As they were finalizing the project deal with the representative of corporate company, the hero Srimanthudu enters and confronts the villains. At the end, he burns down the factory along with the villains and their henchmen. The burning down of the factory along with villains can also be understood, as a form of revenge for what villains have, done to protagonist's father some 20 years ago before his birth. Who was trying to kind of help villagers, to improve their condition through dairy. Now, it may be noted that the burning down of the factory as well as killing of the villagers are justified by the protagonist on the ground that the farmer is making the village disappear, right? By such disappearance would be personal tragedy, not just kind of villagers, but also to the protagonist himself, because he left his own family, home, and then the hometown in order to kind of live in Devarkota along with the villagers, whom he considered his own extended family. And now that very village is kind of in the danger of disappearance. And so he sort of justifies that his act of destroying the factory and also like killing the all the henchmen. So I think I'll stop here. I would be very happy to kind of listen to what your reflections. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicola, for the help.
Thank you very much, Sam, for opening out various issues for discussion. Anyone who wants to come in at this point, you're most welcome. Please unmute yourself if you want to speak so that I know and I can call you out. Yeah, Nishi and Shailaja both have unmuted. Any one of you can just go ahead. Shailaja, ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೀರಾ? Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಶ್ಯಾಮ್ ಸರ್ ಏನ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಟೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಸರಿ. ನನಗೆ ಅನ್ಸಿದ್ದು ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಟೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ನೋಡ್ಲಾಗ್ತದೆ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಪಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕೆ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಹೋಗೋದು, ಉದ್ಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮದವರಿಗೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ಪಟ್ಟಣದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋ ಈ ಕಾರಣಗಳನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡು ವಲಸೆಯನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ಲಾಗ್ತದೆ. ಅಥವಾ ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಏನಿದೆಲ್ಲ ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನ ಉತ್ತಮಗೊಳಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಲು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಕೂಲಿ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಂಡು ನಾ ಹೇಳೋದು ಹೈ ಪೇಡ್ ಸ್ಯಾಲರಿ ತನಕ ಹೋಗೋದನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ ಸೆನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ತಾರೆ, ನೋಡ್ಲಾಗ್ತದೆ ಇದುವರೆಗೂ. ಬಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಟೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಹೇಗಂದ್ರೆ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಸ್ವ ಇಚ್ಛೆಯಿಂದ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ರೆಸ್ಪೆಕ್ಟ್. ಬಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ಗೆ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಕಾರಣಗಳಿವೆ ಅಂತ ಆ ಆಯಾಮಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸ್ತು ನನಗೆ ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮು. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಭೂ ಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅನೇಕ ರೈತರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ಬೇಕು, ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೋತಾರೆ. ಅದರ ನಾರಾಯಣ ರಾವ್ ಅದರ ಒಂದು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದ ಒಂದು ಏನದಲ್ಲ ಆ ಒಂದು ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯನ್ನ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅವ್ರು, ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ತಡೆಯೋದು. ಆದ್ರೆ ಏನಂದ್ರ ಆ ದೇವರ ಕೋಟ ಬಹಳ ಫಲವತ್ತಾದ ಪ್ರದೇಶ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದೇನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಒಂದ್ ಇರುತ್ತಲ್ವಾ, ಅವರು ಆ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಅನ್ನ ಕ್ಯಾಪ್ಚರ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅದರಿಂದ ಹಣವನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಉದ್ದೇಶದಿಂದ ಅಲ್ಲಿರುವ ರೈತರಿಗೆ ಅವರ ಉದ್ಯೋಗವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಲು ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡದಂತೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ಲಿಕ್ಕರ್ ಮೂಲಕ ಅವರ ಡೈವರ್ಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ, ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಶಕ್ತಿಯನ್ನ ಅದನ್ನ ಆ ಒಂದು ಕಡಿಮೆ ಮಾಡುವ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವೂ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಏಕಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ರೈತರ ಸಂಕಷ್ಟಗಳು ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಸ್ವತಃ ರೈತರಾಗಿರುವುದಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ಈ ಭೂ ಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಹೇಗೆ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಅದು ತೊಂದರೆ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಗ್ರಾಮದ ಹಿಂದುಳಿವಿಕೆಗೆ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ಚುನಾಯಿತರಾದ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳೇ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಕಾರಣರಾಗ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಗ್ರಾಮದ ಹಿಂದುಳಿವಿಕೆಗೆ ನಾವು ನೋಡೋದು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಪಡೆದಿಲ್ಲ, ಅವರ ತಿಳುವಳಿಕೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮೂಢನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಯಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಗ್ರಾಮದ ಹಿಂದುಳಿವಿಕೆಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಹಿಡನ್ ಆಗಿ ಈ ತರದ ಭೂ ಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಸಂಗತಿಗಳು ಕೂಡ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಇಡೀ ಊರೇ ಗುಳೆ ಹೋಗುವಂಗೆ ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಕೃತಿ ವಿಕೋಪಗಳಿಂದ ಬರ ಬಂದಾಗೆ ಇದು ಬಂದಾಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಬಟ್ ಭೂ ಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಒಂದ್ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಒತ್ತಾಯ ಪೂರ್ವಕವಾಗಿ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಅನ್ನು ತಕೊಂಡು ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಓಡಿಸೋ ಒಂದು ಸಂಗತಿ. ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಇದರಿಂದ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ನೆಪವಾಗಿ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇದನ್ನ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅನಿಸ್ತದೆ ನನಗೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇವರು ನಮ್ಮ ಅಮರೇಶ್ ನುಗ್ಡೋಣಿ ಗೌರಿಯರು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಕಥೆಯನ್ನು ಬರ್ದಾರೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿಯೂ ಕೂಡ ಈ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ಗೆ ಈ ಒಂದು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ರೈತರಾಗದೇ ಇರೋ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ಕಿಂತ ಅವರು ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ಏನಂದ್ರ ಒಂದು ಕೃಷಿ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕರು ಸುತ್ತಮುತ್ತ ಬಂದಂತಹ ಜನ ಪಟ್ಟಣದಿಂದ ಮತ್ತು ಬಂಡವಾಳಶಾಹಿಗಳು ಬಂದವರು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ವರ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಆದಾಯ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂತಂದಾಗ ಅವರು 10 ಲಕ್ಷ 8 ಲಕ್ಷ ಆದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಅದನ್ನ ರೆಸಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡುವ ಮೂಲಕ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಉದ್ದೇಶಕ್ಕೆ ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ 3 ಲಕ್ಷ ಅಥವಾ 4 ಲಕ್ಷ ಆದಾಯ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೃಷಿಗೆ ಥ್ರೆಟ್ನಿಂಗು ಏನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಕೇವಲ ಸಾಲ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಅಜ್ಞಾನ ಇವು ಯಾವೂ ಕಾರಣ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಇವಷ್ಟೇ ಕಾರಣ ಆಗಿರೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಇನ್ನು ಬಹಳ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಆಳದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಕಾರಣಗಳಿವೆ ಅನ್ನೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ನನಗನ್ನಿಸ್ತು. ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಈಗ ಈ ಒಂದು ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯನ್ನ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಅದನ್ನಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಶಿಕ್ಷಣವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾವ್ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಅದು ಓದೋದು, ಉದ್ಯೋಗ ಅಥವಾ ಎಂಟರ್ಪ್ರಿನರ್ ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ. ಬಟ್ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಪಡೆದವರಿಗೂ ಒಂದಂದ್ರೆ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮೀಣ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಓದಿದ್ದನ್ನ ಅನುಷ್ಠಾನಗೊಳಿಸುವುದು. ಅದನ್ನ ಹೀರೋ ಮೂಲಕ ಒಂದು ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಮಾಡೋಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸ್ತು. ಬಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸರ್ ಹೇಳ್ದಂಗೆ ಲಾ ಅನ್ನ ಕೈ ತಕ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅಡಾಪ್ಷನ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ವಿಲೇಜ್ ಅಡಾಪ್ಷನ್ ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್, ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಬಂದ ನಂತರ ಅನೇಕರು ಅದರ ಒಂದು ಏನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಇನ್ಫ್ಲೂಯೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅನೇಕರು ಅದನ್ನ ಗ್ರಾಮದ ಅಡಾಪ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಹಾಗೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಹಾಗೆ ನಡೆಯುವ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ಅಥವಾ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಾನು ಹೊತ್ತುಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕಾದ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯಿಂದ ಹಿಂಜರಿತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತದೆ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಅಪಾಯನು ಸರ್ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅದು ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್. ಅದು ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಬೇಕಾದಂತಹ ಸಂಗತಿ ಏನು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಸರ್ಕಾರವೇ ತನ್ನ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯನ್ನ ನಿರ್ವಹಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದರ ಒಂದು ಸಂಗತಿ ಈ ಕಡೆಗೆ ಜನರ ಮೈಂಡ್ ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಡೈವರ್ಷನ್ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಒನ್ಸ್ ಅಗೇನ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಇರ್ತಾರೋ ಆ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಇದ್ದವ್ರ ಕಡೆ ಗಮನ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸರ್ಕಾರವು ಕೂಡ ತನ್ನ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯಿಂದ ಹಿಂಜರಿತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತದೆ. ಈ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಎದುರಾಗೋ ಒಂದು ಥ್ರೆಟ್ನಿಂಗ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇದು ಒಂದು ಹಂತದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಸಂಚಲನ ಉಂಟು ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಅನ್ಸಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಏಕಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಸಂಚಲನೆ ಡೆಮಾಕ್ರಸಿಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಥ್ರೆಟ್ನಿಂಗ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅನ್ನೋದರ ಸಂಗತಿ ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಅನ್ನ ಆದ ಪರಿಣಾಮಗಳು, ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ನಂತರದ ಪರಿಣಾಮಗಳ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಮಾತ್ರ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನ ಬೇರೆ ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಟೈಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡುವ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನನ್ಗನ್ಸ್ತು.
Thank you very much for the detailed response, Shailaja madam. I'll just quickly summarize some of the key points that she's making. First, she mentioned how this film, what is this film's take on migration. Generally, one thinks that migration to the cities from the rural areas is largely for better opportunities that are available in the rural areas, in the urban areas. But she pointed out how in this film, what is the role of the land mafia in driving out people from the village towards the cities. So it's not necessarily something positive that they're seeking out better opportunities. Rather, they're being pushed out of their land, and therefore they are forced to migrate to the cities. She pointed out how the various ways in which, for instance, land may be taken up for developing as a resort, and how there are threats to the pursuing of agriculture. She mentioned Amaresh Nugadoni's short story in this regard. She also pointed out how this film also draws out the social responsibility of the educated, how or what they have to do with their education or give back to society through their education. But the point that Sam made is also something that she agrees with, that democracy certainly is under threat. Even though this film seems to have brought about some kind of churning in the village through the developmental activities undertaken by the protagonist, she agrees with Sam that somewhere it seems like the elected government or the state has withdrawn and has vested the responsibility of development and taking care of the villages to non-state actors like the protagonist over here. Yeah, that's what I have noted. Sorry, Shailaja madam, ಏನಾದ್ರು miss ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ
ಇಲ್ಲ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದನ್ನ ಇನ್ನೂ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಿ.
okay, okay. Yeah. So, Sam, would you like to respond to what Shailaja madam has said, or you agree mostly with what she has to say?
She pointed out, both the sides. In fact, I agree with her actually. Um, in a way, especially the migration, migrant workers, point, it's how, the people were kind of pushed out of the villages, by, various this nefarious acts, the land grabbing, and then, not kind of allowing them to access the, natural resources and so on. It's, definitely true. Um, yeah, I mean, basically, she's right actually. All the time, like, we have been kind of, bombarded with these ideas that, people are kind of, moving to this, urban areas, for a better opportunities. But, if there are kind of, facilities available, why would they want to kind of, come to, urban areas also? Especially not the educated lot, but then, for instance, like, people like, who kind of, completely depend upon agriculture. Why would they want to kind of, leave that, altogether life there, and then, move on to this, urban areas, where they lose their sense of, individuality, sense of belonging, and so on. They, neither belong to village now, they're not to the, urban centers. If you look at our migrant workers, the people who are working among stuff as like, it's completely, they are neither here nor there sort of thing. It's kind of a, somewhere I mentioned that, they became, I mean, the migrants actually, as if, they're sort of, foreigners. The way the media projecting, the way the, the urban elite actually like treats them as if they don't belong, to the citizenry, larger citizenry. They're sort of outsiders. Yeah, but that's also because of the class locality, and then definitely caste locality also involved in that. So thank you, madam, for pointing out all that points. I don't deny that, the responsibility educated people, but my only concern is that, for instance, like, I'll tell you kind of, people like me kind of, we, state is very, very essential. State is very important. Although I agree with that, the civil society has to kind of, play a key role, so that, state will be kind of, on its toes. But at the same time, like, when, when the civil society takes over the responsibility of the state, then that is a problematic, not definitely to the elites, but then definitely from the, lower caste, lower class, and the lower caste background. If you look at, from that perspective, then that is a problem. Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Sampath, you have unmuted. Please go ahead. Do you want to respond?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, actually, if you go into the political acts of the movie background, especially if we go the SEZ, Special Economic Zones Act 2005, because most of the time, so why this special economic zones act in 2005? Most of the land is grabbed by these special economic zones, and most of the farmers are lost their land and migrated to the cities. That is the main cause to migration to the cities of poor farmers. That is one thing. And another case is actually in AP and Telangana. If compared to these two states, they have approved nearly 100 SEZ compared to the 400 SEZs in all over India. One fourth of the SEZs are in AP and Telangana. So this is also another kind of land. In South India also, nearly they have 250 270 SEZs compared to the total of 400 SEZs. So our South Indian states are more business people, so that's why these people this special economic zones people want to move all of us to the city to work in construction labor or in any other resources. That is a small thing. And who know the special economic zones? If we go to the antagonist. First, the antagonist know the where the SEZs will come. So in the beginning also they know the special economic zones will come the sea area of the north coastal Andhra. So that's why he want to grab as many acres, as many thousand acres he want. That is the main thing to look into the land grabbing in the movie, especially in the how the protagonist want, because of the he is the politician, he is a local power. The local power person is his brother, so that's why he want to grab uh, all the village lands is brother's name, but the politician will not come in figure. That is the main thing to observe. And another thing, actually, most of the times, if you talk about the antagonist thing, so the adaptation, village adaptation is actually not started after the Srimantudu movie. Actually, this started far before this movie. Actually, this Srimantudu movie adopted this theme because of most of the people are adopting small villages, because of people are lost faith in system. So the individual persons, billionaires have their own capacity, or they're spending their own money. So that's why they have some hope of non-corrupted things. And if we donate their money to a government, they go and so much corruption will happen, and the money will not reach the target audience. That is one thing I want to share with you.
Okay, thank you, Sampath, for your response. Sam, do you have anything to say at this point?
Not really, but something this special economic zones. I think one needs to kind of brought into this conversation also. Thank you very much, Sampath Kumar. On that point, I would look into that.
Yeah, anyone else would like to come in at this point? Yeah, Tarakeshwar, please go ahead.
Just a quick clarification for further discussion. We need to make a distinction between these MPs adopting villages and the other individuals, corporates adopting villages. So the MPs adopting villages began in 2014. So it is mandatory for every MP to adopt a village from 2014 onwards, end of 2014, after the BJP government came into power. So Sansad Adarsh Gram Yojana began. So as part of that, they are adopting. So that, and then the individuals adopting villages, actors adopting villages, and then as part of corporate social responsibility, adopting villages. This there need to be made. We need to make this distinction, and then discuss it. So that's the quick point that I wanted to make at this stage.
Okay.
Thank you, Tara. Yeah, I agree with that. But then, on that front also I have problems. Like, why, specifically one or two villages, they're given the task of, adopting villages. Maybe let others also kind of speak on that. But I am sort of, I'm not so happy with this, scheme. The MPs actually, it's a mandate. It's a mandatory thing that they have to adopt one or two villages in the constituency. If the MPs who are kind of elected by all the people in the constituency, if if they're equally responsible, and then if they kind of focus upon this one or two villages, what would happen to the rest of the villages? Like, they would also feel left out, right? So I mean, it's not a question to you, but generally to the government. Yeah. Yeah, but no, yeah, that distinction one needs to kind of understand, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, anyone else? Yes, Rajan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I like the movie very much, and I like your presentation also. And the one or two points that the movie brought up, right? Of course, it's a movie which shows a lot of hope and gives you a nice positive feeling in all the dark times that we are facing today, right? Which is not very different from what the villagers are facing, right? But that's still only real life. Okay, but at the other side is what happens to the idea of the model of the village and the model of the city. And Ambedkar is against the rural thing. And of course, the movie doesn't bring out caste at all. There's no comment on caste. It's only about class, more or less, right? And owning of land, right? So that's probably not a statement that it's making. But then the question of Ambedkar advising people to move from the villages into the cities because the villages are cesspools of caste and all those kind of things. Yeah, I think that is something else that struck me. But what is also important is the idea of philanthropy, right? And that's the question that is constantly raised. Why are these people adopting a village, right? What are the kickbacks? Okay, all those things are not known to many of us, right? And what are the advantages people are getting? Because philanthropy is not innocent anymore. Whether take Bill Gates or take anybody else, we know that it's got strings and pullbacks and all those kind of things. So these are very suspect kind of categories, right? So yeah, so these are some of the things I would like to say.
Thanks, Rajan. Sam, any response?
Yeah. So thank you, sir. For those comments. Particularly the Ambedkar's idea of moving away from this urban, villages to urban centers. Also the land question. And I mentioned that Koratala Siva is actually the director of the film. He came from this communist background. His father. In a village very near to Guntur town. It's all that locality. Some 20 years ago, it was kind of all communist regime. So it's not that he's not aware of this land question, and also like the caste, and then and then involvement of land and then caste question too. But I suppose this is how this the directs also like doesn't want to kind of put those into that very in a way not that but very politically I don't know like what to say, as if there is no caste at all, like in the village everybody's kind of one community as a village people as kind of one community. Interestingly, obviously some 20 yes, especially in my childhood, if I kind of irrespective of this caste locality, but when as children we all used to kind of play, and then as we grew up also like we used to call not like with this respectable terms. I come from this lower caste background, and then somebody coming from this Brahmin or Kamma or Reddy background, we still kind of used to kind of call them with their names. I think that in a way, that relationship was also there. It's not that it's completely not there, but at the same time, largely that's a privilege for the educated people. But it was not there for the people who kind of not gone to schools or colleges and so on. But the land question is completely silenced here, not talked about. And then I think this idea of moving away from village. I think the context. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. Now I think there is a need to kind of revise this idea of moving away from villages to the urban areas, because whether one is kind of lives in rural villages or urban areas, one is particularly who are sort of coming from this lower caste background, they are haunted by this caste structure, right? Especially if somebody is kind of not either earning in the middle class category, lower caste, and then if it doesn't come under this middle class category, then they would be kind of treated as kind of untouchable or lower caste category wherever they're working actually. The caste actually haunts. So in a way I'm just thinking isn't it better actually kind of, because, and as I said, like, the coming from this, rural areas to urban areas, they neither belong here nor there. And then, they lose their sense of, respectability, dignity. And then, in the process, they lose themselves, that way, isn't it better actually for them to stay in the villages, and then improve their own conditions, in the villages, rather than kind of, coming here and then living a life of, wretched life here in the urban, areas, without their persona, as a human beings. So, what I'm trying to say that, wherever they are, actually, this is a caste haunts. So in such a scenario, isn't it kind of better for them to stay in the villages, but yeah, as I said, like, I could be wrong also. I would like to kind of listen to other people.
No, I think if they're in a city which is not so cosmopolitan, yes, the caste might be recognized, right? But if you go to a city like Bombay, maybe your caste doesn't show, right? So if you come from some part of, nobody might even know about your caste, nobody might even care, right? So I think that might be the case, but not all the cities are like Bombay. So I think that's where you have a point, and I think we need to think about that. Another thing I wanted to ask is this whole idea of development, right? Which it becomes a part of the movie, and that's part of the government from Nehru right to Modi, right? We have this idea of the developmental model, and I think that is something that has to be questioned. Yeah, because when I'm doing Latin American studies, I find that what happens over there is they're very critical about this developmental model, because this is just a market for the capitalists or the Europeans and Americans to sell their products, right? So, so that's what I think is important for us, because they're talking about progressive kind of thinking, which is something that Paulo Freire and other people get up, right? So, and actually there is a hint of that in the movie, though it's not developed, right? Because the idea of this pedagogy, which is for the adults and contributing to development and the action, reflection, action, Paulo Freire model and all those things are possibilities to actually work with the village, right? So asking about, of course, it's going to take a long, long time, but it's then of course you don't need to leave if you get people who are educated enough or ask questions about caste, try to undo caste in the village, which I don't know whether we can do, because the caste system is really very binding all over the place, as we know, right? So, but I don't think we should give up hope also, right? But this question of the developmental model is easy, right? And that's exactly where the film perhaps is gets problematic, right? So you suddenly get this this lovely, nice little village, and everything is okay and all that kind of thing, right? So that's a very easy kind of thing, that just go for the developmental model and everything will work out. But that's not it, because when it comes to social relations, when it comes to caste, when it comes to the village politics, I think all those things need a lot of work, right? And that's very slow and painful kind of social work, which I don't know if anybody actually does, right? Maybe some people like Stan Luthuswamy and all those people have kept doing all those things, but otherwise, and of course, they're working in tribal areas which are quite different from caste-based villages. Right? I think I've spoken too much, right?
Thank you, Rajan. You want to respond, Sam?
No, I'll listen to.
Yeah, Geeta had unmuted. Geeta and then Nishi.
Yeah,
Geeta first.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sam, for your very interesting analysis of the film. I mean, the film is very obviously advancing a hyper-masculinist discourse. And so what was interesting for me is the way the female lead, you know, the protagonist, the female protagonist is represented. She's supposed to be studying for a degree in rural development. But when it comes to her role in her own village, she's not able to, you know, carry forward her education there and do anything over there. It is all only Harsha who is, working in the village. And this girl, when she goes back, in fact, she's, just leaving the village towards the end of the film and has to be, and her family is stopped by Harsha. So I think that's, a very, of course, in this very hyper masculinist discourse, the woman has to be, I guess, represented in this manner. But that was for me a rather disturbing thing in the film.
Thanks, Geeta, for bringing a very important dimension of the film. Sam, do you want to respond? Or
No, but I think I just kind of say one sentence. Basically, this has been kind of a trend. Probably other friends, learned colleagues, who are here, they might kind of throw some light on this. But this has been a kind of trend. If not all the films, but majority of the films, like the heroine is there for the sake of she has to be there. Otherwise, the female character, the leading role. I suppose here, at least in this film, there is some role has given to her, but in otherwise, in other Telugu films, just kind of just dance numbers. That's all. But I see this point, madam. Actually, the hyper masculine discourse. I really like that phrase. While while writing or revising the paper, and I will kind of pay some attention to that. Thank you so much.
Nishi, please go ahead.
Thank you for this discussion and for deciding to talk on this film. I watched the film simply because I wanted to be part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Otherwise, possibly I would not have watched this film at all. But as I was watching, I watched it just this evening. I was reminded of Swadesh, actually. And of course, there is a difference in Swadesh. We have the Shah Rukh Khan character traveling from the US to India with certain idealistic notions. But I don't know, I felt that kind of a connect somewhere, because here, of course, he's moving within India from urban locale to the village with idealistic aims and hopes of doing, and which he does also very, very conveniently and very easily. And the other thing that I was, as the discussion went on, I was thinking about the idea of migration that keeps coming in constantly. And I found that character, the one who mans the shop at the bus stop, who keeps this count of people who have remained. I mean, he's not counting the number of people who have gone away, but he's keeping a count of the people who remain in the village. And I found that a very telling, actually. And I think, I mean, if migration, I think, is a very, very important idea. And in this discussion as well, I mean, a number of people have pointed that out. So that was what came into my mind as I was watching. I mean, these two things were the only two things that struck me, because otherwise, as Geeta says, I mean, and as Sam also said, in Telugu films, we don't have the heroine doing anything. Of course, here she does have a small little role, in the sense that it is because of what she says, and because she tells him that, his family belongs to Devarakota. Because of that, he decides to go back. So she does have some kind of a role, but otherwise, in Telugu films, the heroine is just there for the song and dance numbers, as you said. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Yeah. You want to respond, Sam?
No, I mean, I did not watch that film, no, Swadesh. Shah Rukh Khan film, I suppose. Somebody suggested me to kind of watch that film also. I did not do that. Probably I'll watch it.
Sambhaya, the other film that you might want to watch along with Swadesh is a 2003. I think Swadesh was a 2004 film. 2003, there was a Kannada film called Chigurida Kanasu with Shivraj Kumar. More or less, the narrative trajectory is quite similar.
see.
Grandson coming back to the village after the father, due to certain incidents, has chosen to distance himself from the village. He's educated in BHU, and then comes back to the village to start various schemes of rural reform. So I just wanted to share that, these are two films, Swadesh as well as Chigurida Kanasu, 2003 film that you might want to watch along with this for
Right.
expanding on your paper.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just Nicola, Nishi madams, the other point, on migration, due to some mic disturbance, I couldn't kind of gather her point, if you remember that point, could you?
Nishi, you want to come back with the point on migration?
I remember that she said, the shopkeeper kind of, moves on kind of counting the.
Yeah. Nishi, do you want to come back? I think she's got disconnected. She said
Okay.
she found it. She's here. She said she found it very. Yes, Nishi, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I am done. I just.
No, he wanted. Sam wants to know your second point about migration, the count that is maintained.
Yeah. I think that trope of migration which is used in the film, where the people move to the bus stand with whatever they have, and this is shown quite a number of times, and each time the Rajendra Kumar character is trying to convince them not to go and to stay back, because there are certain things that they can look forward to in the village. And I found that particular the more than once it happens, and at the bus stop there is this shop, and the shopkeeper, each time a family leaves, he counts 521, 520, and I found it very interesting, because what he is the number that he is referring to is not the number of people who are leaving,
Correct.
but the number of people who remain back in the village.
I think that we get to know about that number when the hero comes to village, right? The 522, 521.
So I think the idea of migration is constantly harped on in the film. I mean, I think that is, that's what I took out from the film, this migration being constantly referred to, of people moving from the villages to the cities. And this is something which has always happened, right, in every part of India. This has always happened, where you have people moving to the cities for better opportunities, better lifestyle, kind of a thing. And since last year, the issue of the migrants have become even more disturbing, so.
Just on a different note, I have this a problem with this very terminology, in the sense like why these people would be kind of has to be termed as migrants, because this is our own country, right? We are not kind of migrating to different country altogether. This is within we are moving. Anybody can kind of work at any place, right? In a way, I sort of coming from this Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, and then I studied in Hyderabad, and then I am now working in Bengaluru, Niklas place, Tarakeshu and others place. So I'm just wondering whether I'm sort of constitute the kind of part of that migrant community.
Yeah, I think this is the only country where we are tourists in our own country as well. I mean, I stay in Bengal, and if I move to the south, I'm a tourist out there as well. So I think that's because of the country that we live in as well, the dynamics of it.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is like stigmatized identity, right? The idea of migrants. That sort of recently kind of gained the stigma, attached to that stigma, to that identity, as if they don't belong to this citizenry. They are kind of separate.
But I would wonder whether migrant is something that has to do with class. right? Because I think that's where it comes across, at least in the recent. I don't think you and I would be. I'm also a migrant, if you like, and we've been migrants for maybe more than 100 years, right? So I don't. I've never lived in my native place. I don't know the language, all those kind of things. But who would call me a migrant, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's actually only the really poor laborers who go around the place. I think they would be the migrants.
Yes, sir.
But going back to that migrant question, this has become a trend I find with most of the students over here, right? Where they say, look, if you're not happy, you can go. It's not so easy to go. I don't think it's easy to move from one place to the other, right? And that whole thing of migrant in the film, it looks very easy, but it's not easy, right? And I think that doesn't strike us because we're looking at the film and yeah, it looks quite easy.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Jayanto and then
Yeah.
Shailaja madam. Jayanto, please
Okay.
go ahead, and then Shailaja.
Okay. I would rather not go into, you know, the politics of the film. I'd rather talk about, and Rajan pointed out, and it has been pointed out. First, let me just briefly talk about this whole issue of migration has been there from a very, very long time in cinema. It is nothing very new in this film. From Do Bigha Zameen, Bimal Roy's to Gaman Muzaffar Ali's, which was about 15, 20 years old. Ever since, you know, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of failure of Nehruvian socialism, you know, the question of land, the question of caste, whatever. People have not found a livelihood in their villages and they've been constrained to. And now later on, it acquires a different dimension when, particularly, you know, post-liberalization, when they get attracted to certain things which are available only in the city, and they don't want to be in the villages anymore because the villages have not developed, you know. So that is the problem. What I am trying to say that if we are looking at a difference between Swadesh and this film, I think the difference is very simple to my mind, is that Swadesh was created in the realistic model, you know, whereas if I am not mistaken, we will not have to go to very far to come to the conclusion that this whole film is in the epic mode. You know, it's in the mode of the epic. Now, this may sound a little far-fetched at this point of time. So let me tell you that we will talk very briefly about the main traits of an epic cinema, and also the characteristics of an epic hero, you know. And like all epics, this film also begins in medias res, which is in the beginning of things, right? It does not start at the beginning. It does not start at the end. It begins at the middle of things. It begins with an invocation. And here we find that that whole song about, you know, the Ram Navami thing is actually an invocation to Lord Rama. And at the same time, there is a very, very powerful suggestion that here is not an ordinary mortal whom we are looking at. This is an incarnation of Lord Rama himself, you know. And that is again an epic convention that the hero is always, you know, of a very noble birth, and he has a very elevated status and all that, and they have superhuman capabilities. They finish what others only attempt to, you know, like his own father had failed in trying to do something to this village, whereas he succeeds, you know. And there is always a very important part of the film, of any epic, you know, whether it's an epic poem or whether it is an epic film, that there is a very supernatural epic kind of a battle. And the last scene, I think, can be compared very favorably with that, you know, that everything, it's like a Brahmastra has been released by the protagonist, and the whole evil empire is totally demolished, you know. So it's very consciously tries to draw a parallel between an epic and this thing, you know. And the setting is always vast, you know. And the main thing is the poet is always, he is objective and he is omniscient. I mean, nowhere do we see any reality through anybody else's eyes, but for the poets, but for the writers, but for the directors. Now, these are all, I mean, this mold, the heroic epic mold in which Mahesh Babu's character has been created. I mean, he's been even given a vahana, otherwise it would have been, I mean, that cycle of his is nothing, less than the vahana of an epic hero, of an epic, for God, as it were, like people, young men from his class, they would be much more normally be seen around, going around in very flashy cars. But that would not do. If everybody does it, how will we make this man different? So he goes around in a bicycle. And then, of course, we have this whole epic style. Nowadays, unfortunately, any film which is made on a very, very big budget, it automatically becomes synonymous with an epic style, Whereas all the, the camera, the lighting, the camera angle, the distance, the shot size and all that, they are subservient to only one thing, is to make everything very, very brightly visible so that you can't miss out. So the camera doesn't say anything, the editing doesn't say anything. All it says, it makes you see everything very big, very clearly, So it's a kind of a filmmaking, which is again, much more close to the side. And it is not even an epic film, because an epic film is always, it deals with a very large number of, supernatural things, it deals with elements where everything is at a superlative level, like the 10 Commandments, the Red Sea, dividing for Moses, and, cataclysms of an epic size. Nothing like that happens. So it is the epic style. It is the epic style, and which is because, partly it is because the hero has been created in this fashion. As far as the politics is concerned, I don't know, because study of cinemas coming from a particular region, it's also a very useful tool to study the, the cultural studies of a particular location. I mean, I'm not trying to be judgmental, and it is certainly not meant to be pejorative, but even in the South, I'm not trying to, that could this film be made in any other language? I mean, could it be even made in Kannada? Certainly, could this film be made in Malayalam? Could it be made in Bengali? I don't think it is possible, So we must ask ourselves these questions, whether it is the whole cultural edifice that the state here in this state, let's say in a smaller unit of the state, decides to create for itself, wherein it would be like to be seen as the Mahesh Babu of Devarakota. That is the whole purpose. And therefore, we will never have realism under these circumstances, Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very, very important intervention, Jayanto. Do you want to respond, Sam?
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Excellent, points. In fact, all along, I have this, starting from that song. Tarak has also pointed out, thank you, Tara, on that point, Lanka Dahana thing. But it all, I was actually thinking that, the all pervasive, the hero's role. In fact, I wanted to kind of understand, I noted down, each and every scene that the hero appears, I, try to kind of, point, understand, the characteristic features like, the generosity, the romantic, or the bravery, and then, the way he behaved, all those, all those, points I noted, elsewhere. But I want to kind of I also kind of sought, my colleague SV's, help on that. to so I'm just, it's true actually. If you look at the invocation, the idea of the ends means justifying the ends, that the idea that dusta shikshana sister rakshana, right? If you kind of bring that point here, I think that very much justified here at the violence actually. But I will take that forward on that point. The other point that you mentioned, I think it is very, very crucial whether these sort of films can made in Kannada or Bengal or Malayalam. You're right. In fact, it's very much kind of I think if you kind of look at literature that's kind of like weekly novels or monthly novels that's kind of published and then the films, through that I gather what is that the losing of dominance by the dominant caste, the upper caste in the villages, because a majority of them actually gone to urban areas. And then they, in a way, the earlier generations, like what they used to have this control dominance in the rural areas, that is not there actually. They lost. I mean, both on account of that their own migration, but also on account of this the assertion of the lower caste. And then in a way land also moved from the upper caste to the lower caste, not in kind of huge amounts of land, but a small half acre or acre of land, so some assertions taking place. And so through that process, of course the democratic schemes and the government state benefits and so on, the lower castes have become assertive. And then the upper caste actually lost their the earlier dominance. Now in a way I see that this is sort of and then I also thought that it's kind of losing of their sense of superiority in the urban areas. Like in rural areas, everybody, if you are coming from this dominant community, the rest of the lower caste group would recognize you and then salute you and so on. But whereas urban areas, who cares about like who, as Professor Rajan mentioned earlier. So that is also like one of the points. They want to kind of get back to this the earlier positions. May not be kind of in the same fashion, but in a different way. Maybe sometime like through politics, and then maybe like the way Srimantudu kind of entering this villages and so on. I see that model actually, like but I think they're trying to kind of get back to the villages, in order to kind of regain lost superiority or lost dominance and so on. A majority of the Kammas and Reddys who are kind of living in America and then in other European countries, they are actually buying up lands, lands for Guntur around Vijayawada or various rural areas. They are kind of buying up lands. I mean, I don't think they would ever come back and then live in these localities, but then like they are buying up. So why this clamor for buying land? Although they would not kind of live here, something that one need to understand. Is that to kind of always want to kind of the connectedness with the villages and rural areas, so as to kind of keep that sense of superiority or something else. But definitely there is a these things needs to be kind of critically thought about very carefully, deeply. But these are my kind of random thoughts. Thank you, Professor.
Shailaja, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
ಓಕೆ, ನನ್ಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಇಡೀ ಟೋಟಲ್ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಅನಿಸ್ತು, ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮೀಣ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತೆ ಅನೇಕ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಸ್ವಾತಂತ್ರ್ಯ ಬಂದಾಗಿನಿಂದ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಆದ್ರೂ ಅದು ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಇನ್ನೂ ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೀವಿ. ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ಗಳು ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಅಥವಾ ಇದ್ರು ಬಹಳ ಕಡಿಮೆ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳು ಫೇಲ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಗ್ರಾಮದೊಳಗಿನ ಕಾರಣಗಳಿಂದಲೋ, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮದೊಳಗಿನ ಕಾರಣಗಳು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಜ್ಞಾನ, ಮೂಢನಂಬಿಕೆ, ಒಂದೇನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಅವರ ಇನ್ಆಕ್ಟಿವ್ನೆಸ್, ಇದು ಕಾರಣ ಆಗಿದೆಯೋ, ಅಥವಾ ಏನ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಗ್ರಾಮಾಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತಹ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳು ಸರ್ಕಾರ ನಡೆಸುವರಿಂದಲೇ ಅದು ಫೇಲ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆಯೋ ಅಂತ. ಅದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ವೆಂಕಟರತ್ನಂ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ರಾಜಕೀಯ ನಾಯಕನನ್ನೇ ವಿಲನ್ ಆಗಿ ತೋರಿಸುವ ಮೂಲಕ ಅವರೇ ಸ್ವತಃ ಭೂಮಾಫಿಯಾ, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮಗಳು ಹಿಂದುಳಿದಿವೆಯೋ ಅಥವಾ ಯಾರನ್ನ ನಾವು ಚುನಾಯಿಸಿ ಕಳಿಸಿದೀವೋ ಅವರ ಕಾರಣದಿಂದ ಗ್ರಾಮಗಳು ಹಿಂದುಳಿಸಲ್ಪಟ್ಟಿವೆಯೋ ಅಂತ. ಭೂಮಾಫಿಯಾ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಯಾರನ್ನ ನಾವು ಎಲೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಕಳಿಸಿದೆಯೋ, ಡೆವಲಪ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದವರೇ ಭೂಮಾಫಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ತೊಡಗಿದ್ದರಿಂದ ಗ್ರಾಮಗಳು ಹಿಂದುಳಿಸಲ್ಪಟ್ಟಿವೆಯೇ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ನಾ ಹೇಳೋದು, ಇದು ವಿದಿನ್ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಆದ ನಂತರದ ಪರಿಣಾಮಗಳನ್ನು ಸರ್ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅನೇಕರು ಅಡಾಪ್ಷನ್ಗೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ ಸರ್. ಏನಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಮಗಳನ್ನ ಅಡಾಪ್ಷನ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ನಡೆಸುವವರು ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಥ್ರೆಟ್ನಿಂಗ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಗ ಯಾರು ನಾವು ಚುನಾಯಿಸಿರ್ತೀವೋ, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಜನರು, ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯ ಜನರು ಆ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಜಾಪ್ರಭುತ್ವವನ್ನ ಉಳಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಲು ಕ್ರಿಯಾಶೀಲರಾಗಬೇಕಾಗ್ತದೆ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಮೆಸೇಜ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿದೆ. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ಯಾವ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳು ಮಾಡಲಾರದ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಯನ್ನ ಈ ಏನಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಫಿಲ್ಮ್, ನಾನು ಹೇಳೋದು ಅದರ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಅದರ ಒಂದೇನದರ ನ್ಯೂನ್ಯತೆಗಳಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಈ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡದ ಅಂತ 100 ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದಲೂ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದಂತ ಅಂದ್ರೆ 60-70 ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದಲೂ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದಂತ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳು ಮಾಡದ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಯನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಮಾಡೋ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆನ, ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ದ ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ನಾ ಹೇಳೋದು, ಈ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಯನ್ನು ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕೂಡ ನನಗೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ.
Dr. Shailaja is asking two very important questions. First, she's talking about how to look at this whole idea of developmental programs which have been there ever since independence, and we are still in a mode of the programs yet to take place. I mean, that is, development has not yet happened in the rural areas. So she's asking, is it because of internal problems within the villages leading to failure? These could be social problems or various other kinds of problems within the village. Or is it because of the ones running these programs? For instance, in this film, the land mafia, through their elected representatives and the way they run the show, is it because of that? That is one of her questions. I think I missed noting the second aspect. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ನಿಮ್ ಎರಡನೇ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಾ? ನಾನು ಮರ್ತ್ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ.
ನಾನ್ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಒಂದು 60-70 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ಗ್ರಾಮೀಣ ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತ ಅನೇಕ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ರೂಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಅದು ತರದ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಯನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಫಿಲ್ಮ್ ಹೇಗೆ?
So the second question that she's asking is how a film is able to bring about certain kinds of changes, whatever problems we may have with the nature of the changes, the actors, the politics of it. In spite of all that, it seems as if the film is able to bring about certain changes that several governmental programs over the years have failed to do. So how do we understand this? This is her second point. Sam, you want to respond now, or I don't know if Tarakeshwar has unmuted, whether his point is related to this. So shall we listen to him first and then we come to you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Tarakeshwar.
Yeah, thank you. It was interesting to listen to a political scientist looking at a film. But I think Sam went overboard to accommodate some kind of narrative content analysis, though he's a political scientist. So maybe he wanted to be acceptable to narrative analysis scholars. But it's interesting and it's actually necessary. I would say that such films are a very important source for an anthropology of state. So I am arguing that the way the state gets represented in many of our popular films is very important to look at in the last 20, 30 years to understand what is happening to the state. I'm not saying that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the representation of state in the popular films in India and then the what is happening to the state, but there is a relationship, and we can use films as a source to do some kind of anthropology of state, I would say, that apart. So why I'm saying it in the context of this film is we can understand this film as or through a genre, as Dasgupta was trying to point out that it is an epic genre. But I wouldn't call it as an epic genre. Yes, it has focus on the hero. Will that suffice it to be called as a epic genre? I don't know. And then, as he himself was saying, there is a certain absence of supernatural elements. So it is in that sense, though it is not realistic or realism is there, but there is a realistic mode in which this film portrays things. So it is not the realism as we know, but a realistic mode of representation. So in that sense, it is not epic. And the word epic itself, we can't use it, I would say, because it is also, though the Ramayana is invoked throughout the film here. So just because there is a Ramayana imagery in the narrative, then also we can't call it as a epic. But still, in the absence of a better word by our film study scholars to name these, I would simply call it as a hero-centric films in the Indian film industry, where everything is to glorify the hero. Not even actually the hero, actually the actor. So this overlapping of the actor-hero, why it is happening is very important to look at, but I will not comment on that much here. So another is to trying to look at the context of its production. As Sambhaya was trying to do, he brought in the issue of this adopting the village and by the MPs and others, and this film is coming up, and then its consumption to giving rise to others asking him to adopt a village and things like that. So the looking at the production and consumption of the this film to understand the meaning of the film. So that apart from these methodological issues, looking at the this particular film, what is happening here is one is the relationship between the state and the capital. It is not actually state and the civil society. I wouldn't use the word civil society here because there is a complete absence of civil society here. So this individual initiative is actually a capitalist initiative, a Srimantudu's initiative, literally in that sense. So it's an interesting relationship between the capitalism and the state. Or if you can generalize it, because he's not paying from his pocket and he is a board member of a company and the company money is paying there. So it's a corporate social responsibility. So this concept of corporate social responsibility coming into so-called rural development and make it is acceptable to us is something that is happening through this film. Where the state fails, the CSR, the corporate social responsibility, comes in. So in that sense, the relationship between the state and the capital, this film would be an interesting, because in this film, the corruption comes out as an individual trait. It is not a systematic apparatus. It is not an integral part of the state apparatus as we have started looking at it. It only comes as a kind of state is fine. The corruption is only an individual, or it's at the best at the level of a family, or at the best at the level of a particular community. So it is not part of the system as such. So there's no need to overall the change, overall the system, but only you eliminate the individual or a particular family, then it could be the corruption is gone. That kind of narrative is coming across. And then the this corporate social responsibility, philanthropy of development, and then outsourcing of the development by the state. These are very interesting issues to be discussed, I think. So when did state, being the agent of development, became the mediator of development, a kind of commission agent between the people who develop and then the people itself, and then the non-interference of the state in delivering the criminal justice. It cannot take care of the corruption in its own system. Even that has to be outsourced to a person or to the corporate entity, I think. So even it's not the question of, actually, if you look at the issues of water, road, school, it is not even question of development. It's basic infrastructure. So the state in India has already abandoned development to the private sector completely. So at least infrastructure, it claimed that we will provide infrastructure so that other can come and invest and develop it. But now even this infrastructure, which we are trying to call as development, is also being outsourced in the name of asking the corporate sector or the individuals like actors to adopt villages. So that is an interesting moot point that film is trying to represent. And then the non-interference of the state in the delivering the criminal justice and allowing individuals to take not even law, take weapons in their hand and deliver immediate justice. That is quite happening not only in this film. So in that sense, this film is not only limited to this particular region. So that we can see across linguistic regions in the Indian context in all popular mainstream movies in the last 20-30 years. So, but there is a difference. So now this corporate Srimatudu, but earlier it used to be a kind of somebody, angry young man who comes from a subaltern class who will take up weapons to give justice because the state has failed to do justice. From that to a Srimatudu taking weapon and then trying to deliver justice, that shift can be witnessed here. And then this, as I said, this is a hero-centric genre. Though I agree with Das saying that it has certain kind of characteristics. So whatever he pointed out is fine. But I'm only hesitating to call it as a epic genre, that's all. So there is an absence of citizen. That is a creation of individuals being aware of their rights, who could avail the help of the state apparatus when necessary. So they're not represented as citizens, they're represented as victims or recipients of the development, or the non-recipients of the development. So we need to go and give them development. So they're only recipients of development or just the victim. So the agency is completely absent, or even at the community level. So because they have to look up to this fellow, then there's never creating a kind of awareness, forging a bond between them, and they helping him or he helping them to fight their own cause. That is completely absent. So the agency of the community is completely absent. So you need to depend on a messiah from the outside. So if something happens to us, state is not there, there's absent state, and then we need to wait for a messiah to come and clean up things. So that is the kind of narrative this hero-centric film pushes us towards.
Okay, thank you, Tarkeshwar. Paniraj is also unmuted. We'll
Okay.
listen to Paniraj and then Sam, you
No,
can
no,
come.
no, no. If want to need to respond to Shailaja Madam's question, I can talk it later because I want to add one or two things to what Tarakeshwar has said.
Yeah,
So
please go ahead.
No, I should not deviate from Shailaja Madam's question. First, let that be answered.
Sam, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So the first, thank you, madam. Again, for those two important points. I think, the first person's, response kind of lies in both the, points you mentioned. It's, the development programs, for a failure. It's both an account of, internal problems, within the community. And also, obviously, people like, Venkatratnam, the individual, trying to, those who are supposed to kind of facilitate that, they're not kind of delivering. I think, we can kind of safely, or at least, I understand that, at least in my own limited knowledge, I think, this is both on accounts of, internal problems, as well as, on account of this, failure of the facilitators to deliver those goods and programs. The second point, film. So the second point is kind of how the film brought out change.
Yeah, so the point that she's making is what the government could not do for years. A film has managed to, whatever be the nature of the politics of the intervention, the film has managed to bring about some kind of churning in the system. So she's talking about that.
That way, of course, we have to appreciate the, the usefulness of the films, and then at least, there is some effort to kind of bring it up. Again, I suppose, the naive development is kind of seen in a simplistic manner, right? It's true that it kind of brought out these road, and then laying of road, and then hospital, school, and then the water facilities. I think these are some of the basic things, and then in independent, post-independent India, 17 years, we still kind of looking for these sort of things. I think one has to kind of feel ashamed of that, and also one has to kind of appreciate that at least state in the film has to brought. Thank you very much. But if there are other people who kind of contribute to these two points, I would be very happy to hear.
Paniraj sir, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Now that Tarakeshwar has raised an important question about the whole process of mediation in popular films, like Gudimela, I am too attracted towards representation of where state is not intervening. Some popular films are intervening and providing certain psychological justice. Yeah, but now what is happening that there is in 1960s, the films used to come where there was a dream of creating a new democratic society was there post 1 decade of independence, where there was a kind of films which were coming that a village communities has to develop themselves, like iconic films in Kannada like Bhutaya Namagayu, Bangarada Manushya, and all that kind, and even Mayor Mutana, some directorial ventures of Sidlingaya, where they used to bridge the gap between state and the community through the state and the civil society through a community, a proactive community with a leader. That leader is not unlike the hero, what Tara described correctly. He mediates through people, he creates a community. So a vacuum between the state and the society was not as wide as now, and the vacuum was not sucking as of now. Now, as Tara has said, the state is abdicating its role, and civil society, especially the kind of heroes with 1960 films in Bangarada Manushya, Bhutaya Namagayu, or Mayor Mutana, those kind of middle class heroes or semi-literate heroes or literate heroes, they used to be the part of the community, and they are raising as the leaders of the community. That is lacking quite now. That is one point. That means the vacuum which is created between the state and society is so deep that it sucks. It sucks, and you can expect popular films to be like that. That is one point. And the image of a leader emerging now becomes an image of a hero emerging from nowhere. That is the point. Second point I want to make, and again wants to make Gudimela, that this again Srimantudu is followed by Maharshi, right? I mean, there is a series of films like this, Srimantudu, Maharshi, and this kind of films, where you could see a different kind of capitalist intervention. I'm not against capitalist intervention. Capitalist intervention which breaks the routine of feudal hegemony and breaks a different and builds a different community of like what like 50s, 60s Hindi films where hero builds a new urban community. This is not something like this. Here we can see a capitalist relying on a feudal lord, what is well-meaning, what you call a very upper caste or middle caste feudal lord who can protect the society. So what a neo-capitalist hero is trying to do is bringing back the society to the feudal fold, a force of what you call a very generous kind, very kind person who can bring in back like a Gandhian ideology where a trusteeship kind of thing that you can see in Srimantudu as well as in Maharshi. So what is capitalism doing now? Capitalism is liberating the people from, in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and in rural parts of, some parts of northern Karnataka, it is still true to be what is to be a poor farmer, landless farmer. That and what neo-capitalism is not doing is not liberating them and being to be entrepreneurs, whatever good sense or bad sense it is having. But what it is doing is pushing them back to Nirani is a neo-capitalist who wants to act as a neo-feudal. So it's a kind of a society where we are seeing and change is happening, but the change is mediated by neo-capitalist towards neo-feudalism, where there is no difference between feudalism and capitalism. So this is the kind of social system in which these kinds of film being made. Then again, yes, Tarkeshwar has raised. I also want to raise a doubt of the treatment, popular elements of this cinema when compared to the same kind of narratives being offered by Dalit directors about the fate of Dalit statelessness and leaders emerging from the community. So these are the things, I'm not saying right or wrong, but these are the things has to be debated in popular films now, especially with the arrival of Karnan and the debate between the leader and the community is going on. This kind of debate, these are interesting debates that we should do. That's all what I want to intervene. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, that's Karnan, he mobilizes people, right? In a way, he mobilizes. But here, the mobilization would not take place. I think almost all the hero-centric I think SV has written a wonderful in that book. Actually, the hero-centric films means like the people are mobilized, but they're as consumers, as a kind of passively. At the end, it's the hero who kind of gains the prominent role and then as a leader and so on. But Tara, your points of like the state role as kind of from agent to as a mediator, I think that's kind of very, very important. There are several points I kind of really noted down here. All are kind of very, very crucial. Especially the the corporate social responsibility, like the one who approaching. I mean, how do we understand this now? It's like it looks like it's going to be there, for a long time to come. This corporate social responsibility. I think these are the ways through which the corporates also like trying to gain legitimacy in the public domain, right? Otherwise, among the rural folk, there is this idea that corporates are kind of as some sort of mafia, right? They kind of rob people resources and all, like incapacitate the people. There's a huge debate kind of happening in local Telugu states on this corporates, because the reliance the gas where this Krishna Godavari basin how they're taking up and so on. In that context also some discussion happening. But it's very interestingly that the world class, I don't have much to kind of say, but I following Professor Phanira's points, the world classes, world dominant classes, now they have changed this forms. Now they kind of entered into this capitalist fold and so on, and then corporate the avatar of corporates and all, and then they are coming back in a different form altogether. Again they're kind of reproducing their dominance. In the process, like maybe a few individuals, Dalits or like maybe lower caste or other people kind of maybe liberated or maybe kind of economically kind of profited, but it's not kind of the overall community development, right? Empowerment as such. The individuals who are kind of gaining, and then the community as a whole would not kind of given access to this not facilitated or not do not have this access to resources and so on. So at this point of time, I have this much only. But I would like to kind of listen if there are other people who want to kind of.
No, I just want to, as
Thank
you are a political scientist, I don't have much knowledge in the new ideas, but there is not even a kind of Habermasian idea of a society in India now, as of now. I mean, Habermasian idea of civil society. Though Tara talked about civil society, there is no Habermasian civil society here, and we are much frustrated between the state and a kind of a dwindling between corporate and feudal hegemonic corporates. So in that sense, kind of popular narratives which are supposed to come in films are lacking because the filmmakers, the directors who are directing those films are coming from the urban middle class, and their understanding of rural poverty and this kind of lack of communitarian idea or a Habermasian civil society is lacking. That is what creating a kind of, that's why I wanted to pose Dalit narratives against this kind of, say, new capitalist hero narratives. There is a clear lack of understanding about what is happening in the society. But best of the things are coming where urban directors, young directors who doesn't have this idea, coming with an absurd stories, one of which we had discussed in a previous session about Nikhila Yaudri aduna ಒಂದು kidnap story ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ವಲ್ಲ.
ಯಾವುದು ಸರ್ ಕಿಡ್ನಾಪ್?
ಅದು ಆ ಹುಡುಗಿನ ಕಿಡ್ನಾಪ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅದು it becomes that it reality, a screenplay becomes a reality. Okay, I mean that kind of films and Maya Bazaar kind of films in Kannada, where lack of civil society and lack of responsibility from civil society and state is posed through urban criminal comedies. That kind of films are much more interesting in understanding the deeper crevices in society rather than this kind of interventions, which are replacing the interventions like in 60s, 70s film, like Budana, like Bangarad Manisha, like Mayor Mutana, and that is the things which you have to discuss, not to dismiss, which has to be discussed. But thank you for bringing up that film, because it could bring us this disparities and different changing images and what we have to think about. Again, the same I want to bring again Swadesh, Gaurikar Swadesh, which came at the edge of this globalization in 2000s, where he brings back the memory of Gandhiji, and a kind of intervention there was a very different thing. So Gaurikar's treatment, I'm saying I have not seen anywhere after that. So these are the kind of debates I think are much more useful. I'm not contradicting anyone, but we got to pose problematics rather than saying that we have a solutions.
Thank you, Paniraj sir, for that very elaborate comment. Tarakeshwar, yes, please go ahead.
Just about this, the civil society. No, I agree with that. We don't have a civil society as defined by Habermas, but rather than trying to look for this ideal civil society described by Habermas in the Western context, in the Indian context. So I think we need to be more Bottomore. So in Bottomore's book, Marxist Sociology, there's a particular essay which looks at France, I think, in the 19th century, how the traders and others, which are actually seen as a civil society, how they control the state. So this that's why I thought the capitalism and state relationship that we need to look at in the Indian context rather than civil society. Yes, it's useful to hold on to the Habermasian notion of civil society as a kind of ideal to achieve in the Indian context, but it's also important to look at what actually constitutes civil society in the Indian context. Who influences the decisions of the state? So, in that sense, I think rather than Habermas, this book, Marxist Sociology by Tom Bottomer, so there is a particular essay which looks at the French context and tries to understand how the state is influenced by certain forces that existed during that time, looking at that as a kind of civil society. So a force that influences the civil state is seen as the civil society. And if you can identify what is influencing the state today, what forces are influencing the state today in Indian context, that would be useful. So why I'm saying it is again because of this, the stark capitalist connotation this film has. So, and then to discuss about, see, why I'm saying this is important is, in the last 20 years, earlier the capitalists also played a major role in state formation in India. So they used to be in the background and they used to invest in the political parties to the extent that they used to invest in all political parties and then allow political parties to look at it. But somewhere in the last 20 years, what is happening is they have started looking at political parties as corrupt, not as inevitable evils. So it can be not necessary. So what we are seeing is most of these capitalists themselves taking on active role in the politics, becoming MPs. So that can be seen in a stark contrast. Why we should sponsor somebody else? Let me jump into the fray myself. So that kind of shift is also happening. I think in this context, this concept of a Srimantudu coming in and then taking on the role of the state, providing the basic amenities to a village, I think acquires significance, I think. And then with regard to the impact of the movies, that is a very difficult area to understand. It's very easy to understand the narrative or place the narrative in the context of a identify the genre of it and then understand the characteristics of it, or to place it in a particular its context of production or dissemination and make sense of it. But to understand the effect of it on the people, it's very difficult to do that unless you have a theory at hand to just to speculate it. For example, this narrative could be justifying CSR, corporate intervention in politics, state affairs, not just as patron, but as direct actors. So that could be one of them. But as many people have tried to understand the films, you just have to wait. As audience, we just have to wait for a leader to deliver things. So make us to wait for a leader. We waited for a leader and we are getting those leaders. That's a different issue. And then the other could be somewhere it allows me to vent my anger about the failed system. Because looking at Mahesh Babu thrashing these people, I get some kind of satisfaction. Somewhere my anger gets a vent through this as kind of surrogate thing. What I couldn't do, Mahesh Babu is doing it. There's some kind of purgation of my went up anger is also maybe the effect of it. So I wouldn't agree with Shailaja that this film has created some kind of a positive intervention in the village.
Development.
Just because one or two people are adopting villages, I don't give the credit to this particular film, though it might have been presented in that way, or this film might have been a kind of trigger to do that. But the larger forces are in action much before that. So if film is itself is a cause of those forces, and what happens after the film, even adopting the villages by the actor and others, is also a part of that larger process, and film is only a trigger or helps in that process, further in the process. So I don't think it is direct impact of the film as such, but the direct impact could be anything from giving vent to my anger about the system and getting satisfied that Mahesh is thrashing these people, or waiting for the hero to come and deliver and solve all my problems, or trying to accept the capitalist intervention is necessary to eradicate the system. And this capitalist intervention, as Paniraj was also trying to say, is not to break down the feudal bonds. So here there are no feudal bonds, there is no caste. So that kind of here is already a corrupt politician is there. It's only an individual. So eliminate that individual. It is not even breaking those bonds. So in that sense, it is pushing us in that direction. So eliminate the individuals, and then the system would be fine. It doesn't attack the state per se. It doesn't attack any of the what we have identified as feudal elements in the Indian context. So earlier films, yes, there was a modernity versus kind of feudal values kind of represented by a landlord and a semi-educated or educated person coming back. So that education standing for modernity and this landlord standing for feudal values, that conflict was there. But here the conflict is not between that. It's a new mafia, individual mafia, which is trying to usurp the land from the farmers, not for SEZ. State is usurping the land, there's a different issue. It supports the state, but somebody else is trying to take the land and make money when the SEZ comes there. So that is the kind of thing that it is portraying. So it is not even against land usurpation by the state, but only a few people who are making some bucks out of it. So that we have to be careful, I think. I think I'm talking too much at just later. Sorry. Thank you.
Just one point, very quickly, Tara and then Professor Paniras, the Gandhi's idea of trusteeship, if you kind of think, would there be any difference between Gandhi's trusteeship and then now the corporate social responsibility? I'm just kind of thinking aloud. Gandhi trusteeship would not kind of allow people to kind of have an agency. It is the haves who would decide, right? Similarly here also this corporate through this corporate social responsibility. I mean, like, would these people have anything to to decide, the people themselves? I think Ambedkar also actually in Harijan Sevak Sangh, when Gandhi reaches some fund through Thakkar Baba, he was responsible, and then Ambedkar actually wrote to Gandhi that the representation of the so-called untouchable should be there in that, so that they would decide like where to the money has to kind of spend, rather than the people who are in the Harijan Sevak Sangh decides. So similarly here also this corporate social responsibility in that name, money may be kind of coming, and through that they kind of gaining legitimacy, but then in fact in the process the have-nots are also continue to lose their agency. They will not have anything not kind of they're not there to decide for themselves. The other people would kind of decide. I think just
Sam, I thank you for that. When I said trusteeship, when I said that, I also meant it in a double-edged sword, in a sense that when Gandhi was talking about the trusteeship, he had his politics in his hand, and he could mobilize the people, he could mobilize the community to mediate with the trustees. But that is being absent now, and that is not being followed by any Gandhians any now. So that agency of building up grassroots level politics or grassroots level gram panchayat is gone now, and that's the vacuum now. Trusteeship is becoming a corporate responsibility vacuum, which sucks. That is one point I want to make. Second is what you said, the alternatives. As far as you said, that's correct. Political scientists, you should be commenting on it. That left has left, or so-called left in India, has failed to build an alternative civil society. Like, except some parts of Kerala where cooperative movements are coming up, and where right has intervened, like in coastal Karnataka, where right wing has taken more space than the state by creating their own cooperative societies and their politics. That kind of intervention by the left in civil societies, as defined by, I mean, not defined by Habermas, but some kind of intervention where between the state and the people, there is a cooperative, there is a community which mediates, which is self-deciding and which is self-government. That kind of a mediation left has also failed, and why we are seeing this genre of films is because of that vacuum. That is natural, and analysis has to be done in that you should also be critical about the role of the left in not forming a civil society as a communication between the commonest or marginalized people and the state. So these all debates come because of these films, and we should discuss this. That's interesting for me.
Yeah, Tarakeshwar has unmuted.
Just a quick response to this Gandhi concept of trusteeship and then the CSR. Though one might have problems with Gandhi's notion of trusteeships, and certainly Ambedkar's point is valid, but there is a difference between the new CSR and the Gandhi's notion of trusteeship. In Gandhi's notion of trusteeship, there are only trustees. Actually, the money belongs to the society. So Gandhi was very clear about it. You are only a trustee. You are acting on behalf of the society, but you are not the owner of it. So that's the idea of trusteeship. So it belongs to the society, but you act on their behalf. But now it's corporate money we give you. So it's a kind of donation that I am giving. So in that sense, there is a lot of difference between Gandhi's notion of trusteeship and then this corporate social responsibility. And then with corporate social responsibility is with the tax exemption. So it is not even corporate social responsibility. It is
Right.
instead of paying the state, you invest somewhere else, and also get image mileage out of it.
Right. Yeah.
And Sam, I wanted to attract. I mean, I missed your major part because I had to go for our meeting. But another star, Siddharth, I had texted it, had made the same point, that why people like us, influential people like us, to be made special to the government, and we should be acting as something. Why government will not use us as a mechanism of its own governmental mechanism to help the community? Why they are asking us to be stars and contributing to the government, so that we as if we are propagating that, putting us forward rather than government doing with our help. So why government is not taking us to build a community in frequency with the government programs? Why it is pushing us as heroes? He has posed that question in a very lively debate, and he had posed that post. I mean, right wing trolling him. He has posted that video. That question is relevant. He is asking the right question, that young, educated, influential youth, why government is failing to putting them into the action of the government where everybody can demand. Otherwise, if I start giving charity to government, I will be made as a star and I will be influencing. So I don't want that. He posed that relevant question, and he asked society to think about it, and bringing a youth like him into the government communitarian building up mechanism rather than pushing him as a hero. So that kind of new thinking has to come up somewhere.
Yeah, in the chat, Sridhar says maybe we need to think of dangers in the course of talking about stigmatizing. Maybe we are falling in the dangerous trap of stereotyping. Sridhar, you want to come in?
It's too late, Nikhila.
Yeah, no.
But you made the point, you made the point, we just wanted to understand.
See, from the presentation and throughout the discussion, what I could see is one common thing is we are whether it is hero image construction or the CSR or trusteeship or the model of development or whatever. In to demonize it, we are trying to stigmatizing it, saying that it has a hidden agenda, or saying that it has a certain motive. But whereas my worry is that it is not stigma like migration. Why migration became a stigma? Why workers should be in the village, remained in villages? They can move out. So in that, I could see we are thinking that we are engaging with the question of stigma, but we are stereotyping. That is what my worry. Somewhere along the way, we are stereotyping the very processes. So that is very racist and dangerous. And we are self-flagellating instead of looking into the other forces which are in action. So I don't know. I'm worrying listening to entire course of discussion.
Sridhar, do you mean that the film discourages people to migrate?
Beyond film, I am talking about debaters over here.
No. Because since you raised the migration, I don't want to because migration is also the reverse migration has also become. What I'm saying is we are talking into a present absurdities of migration and reverse migration, right? That old idea of people migrating from villages to cities and then coming back to cities to improve the cities, that myth is gone now, right? There's the myth. So now you have to create a new myth of new frustrated migration to urban, coming back and creating a community in society from the grassroots. That kind of myth is not coming. What we are seeing is a kind of a myth where a rich corporate guy comes from urban area and creates a hegemony in villages. That's the problem. That's what we are discussing. So I can agree with you. Like with 650s or 60s, if somebody is talking like in Chandavalli Tota in Kannada, where people say that you going to city is a sin. No, we are not talking like that now. No, I'm just intervening. This is my loud thinking, Sridhar.
Sridhar or Sam, do you want to come in?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay. Okay, Sridhar?
See, a whole crux of the issue is that what I am branding stigma is the kind of connotation we took it. Kind of filmmaking or story building or replicating whatever society, whatever processes we are experiencing. See, actually, when Paniraj sir has said that, brought Karnan picture, then I realized the danger. We are congratulating ourselves by stigmatizing very. This is rationalizing feudalism. This is rationalizing hero worship. This is rationalizing capitalist corporate social responsibility in place of a holistic development, all that. But we are by blaming them or by blaming them we are self-congratulating. We are not engaging with the subject.
No,
No,
I
Sridhar,
don't think
I also
even
told that there is
So
left has also
we are,
said this.
here we are not stigmatizing them. We are stereotyping. That is the danger.
No, I have also
Wait.
told that left has left a vacuum, not creating a civil society in between. So we are talking about sociology.
But are we, Sridhar, I still, fail to understand, are we sort of, hero worshipping them in the sense that, are we not criticizing them? I mean, is it a self-congratulation?
We are congratulating ourselves, we are criticizing.
No,
but
no,
we are not.
Are we?
See,
Okay.
Sridhar, are you saying that we need to implicate ourselves in this project?
Certainly, self-reflective.
Right.
Self-referential should be there. We are not just judges who passes judgments.
Yes,
But we are-
Sridhar. Yes, Sridhar, we'll bring up a film. You introduce Nayador or I
No.
Nayador.
I think you did not get my point.
No, I got your point, but that needs a wider discussion basing on a film. We are taking up entirely a new film and talking on it. Yeah, what you said, it makes sense to me.
So that's a very typical movie of how to make village a career. That's it. I can't see beyond that.
Yeah, that's it. That's what everybody is talking about.
So, but in the course of it, what we are trying, what we are developing a discourse is, actually we are thinking that we are the stigmatizing.
No.
Whatever the output
that
is coming out.
Exactly the point, Sridhar. That I'm very much wonderful. I mean, I was very much wondering, like a careerist cannot come somewhere from some Mars. He's from our society. He's have a class. He's have a social routing, and through he is an agency for something. If you don't believe in that, so there is a difference of intellect between us. That's all.
No, I'm here placing. We are not stigmatizing. We are stereotyping.
No.
That is what my problem is.
Now, what we are saying is, he works as an agency towards a social process, because we understand everyone as a social being through a social process. So that is where the whole debate is going on. What Sam is talking, what Tara is talking, what we are talking, and we are not converging on one thing, but we are disputing, but we are bringing it to a social process where all this is happening. I'm not thinking that he's an individual who is stigmatizing an individual. He's an agency. Why I should think him as an individual?
Sir, my whole point is we are under the impression that we are stigmatizing, but we are not stigmatizing. We are producing stereotypes. They are very dangerous than racism.
Okay. That's right.
Very dangerous than racism. That's what my hunch.
Yeah. Nikhila, we are.
Yes. I just want to ask Sanjay if he wants to respond. Sanjay,
take us to 12 o'clock.
No, I had a very small point regarding.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Characterization in the film. That coming back to the point of Geeta, talking about hyper masculinist characteristic of this hero. So it's not only, of course, we can see that the way heroine has been presented is also demeaning to her, but in fact it applies to all the characters. It's only that the hero is glorified, and we look at the characters, other characters. Most of them are like devalorized. They are presented in such a way that they only highlight the grandeur of the hero. So if we look at, for example, in the beginning, Charu has been shown to have done the course of MBA, then she's doing this rural development. But when we see both of them in the class, then most of the time we see Charu just looking at the hero, and the hero is the Harsha is making notes seriously, and he's studying seriously, trying to understand everything. Then when we compare Harsha with Appa Rao, there is a kind of humiliation of Appa Rao, where we are shown that he's not like a serious character, and he's making jokes, and then he's also trying to take credit of the rural development because he's pretending to have sent his friend to this village. He has inspired him. And not only that, there is also kind of colorism in the film where we see the fair complexion being glorified. And since Appara is British complexion, and he won't be the, the correct match for the heroine. The same applies to Ravi Kant, his father. So there is like there's a parallel narrative that Ravi Kant also tried to bring development to the village. He also studied abroad, I mean, in the city, and then he comes back to the village and tries to apply whatever he has learned in his study, and he's making hard work, and he's trying very hard to to develop the village, but he fails finally. We see him, he goes to the jail, he comes back, and then he leaves completely the village. And the hero, our hero Harsha, he comes back to the same place, not only to the same village, but also the same house where Ravikant lived. So where Ravikant, so what happens till the fight, when the hero has been stabbed, it is almost a parallel kind of narrative with here and there some minor changes in the details. Then he is in the hospital. After that, all of them, like the whole family, Harsha, his father Ravikant, and mother, and all of them, they go back to the village. They go back to the city. Till then, it's like a parallel narrative. But then, as if there is an there is an imperative to change the narrative, to make a happy ending rather than a tragedy. So then the hero comes back in the village. So we find that the hero succeeds where Ravikant has failed, the father has failed. So ultimately, father also has been, given so many negative characteristics at the time when there is celebration of this Ram Navami. Rather than participating in that event, he organizes. It is presented in the film that he organizes the party on the same day. So he, all of a sudden, when we see this flashback that, how interested he was in the development of the village, it seems that he has taken a U-turn completely, and he is no longer interested, he is only interested in money making. So again, this character is, very much devalorized. And look at the cousin. Cousin also, by dishonest means, he's like, he's cheating the family. So there also, there is a enhancing of the image of the hero. That hero is, so working for the family. So even if he is not very much interested in the business, but he's so intelligent that, he can protect the family by his wise decisions, by his smart moves. Then Venkatnan, even in fact, the villains, all the villains have been also, they are not equal match to the hero. Like, what happens that even Venkatratnam, he loses his ministership also because of the hero. That these two people, they go to the city who are traveling in the bus. That is presented by his brother. So what happens that he loses his ministership finally, and then whenever we see the power of the villains, that is only vis-a-vis the village community and the other people, those who are weak, but when it comes to when they come in contact with Harsha, then they are like, very diminutive. They lose their power, and then all of them are there beaten, in group by single-handedly by our hero. So the only exception who seems to be here is in the film is Narayan Rao in the village, that he has that kind of hero image, but finally he also is almost going to leave the village, and finally it is only he's rescued by our hero. So what happens, on the one hand, hero is so much glorified, but how he's glorified? He is glorified only because of the devalorizing of other characters. So other characters have been presented in such a way that we can present such a hero. So how making of a hero takes place at the cost of devalorization of other characters. This is one example in this film. Thank you.
Sanjay, on a congratulatory note, I thought I left somewhere at 9:30 and came back at 10:30. I thought by that time Sanjay would have made character analysis and I have missed it. Thank you, kept it at the end. Kept it at the end and I could hear you. Yeah, that is what. Sridhar, this is what the point we are making that.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Exactly. The Sanjay has brought in the description of the movie whatever I was trying to make out. That was the same point my concern is.
Okay, so thank you, Sanjay is the bridge between Sridhar. Have it. Have him.
I'm a literature student. I don't know what's
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, it appears, we just one point, Nikhila.
Yeah, please.
In Telugu films, how to kind of understand this, hero's role, characteristics or characterization of hero. Something it seems, not many people have written, it seems. Now, I was actually, I mentioned this about it, how do we understand, hero's, character, at some point of time, but you're very right that, by devalorizing others or demonizing others, that, heroes is kind of, project as kind of, epitome of, goodness, generosity, and then, the courageous and so on forth. Yeah. The positive nature of hero comes through the negative images of the other characters. I think nicely made, Sanjay. Thank you.
And one point I want to make in complimentary to Sanjay was in 1950s, 50s, 60s films, it was not like that. Hero used to go through some kind of this kind of Gandhian wisdom in his society. Like old people are not forthcoming, they are not proactive, but they provide a wisdom to developing a character of a hero who become a leader. But Sanjay's character analysis has done correctly. Devalorizing makes a hero. In the older films, value addition makes a hero. So there is a kind of a sociological change has occurred in how do we perceive our society and between old and new. That's the point which should bother us. The vacuum which is created. As a political scientist, you should enlighten us much more.
Okay. It's been a long and very, very interesting discussion. When I watched Srimantadu, to be honest, I did not think it will go this far. Sam, thank you so much for bringing in so many issues in the beginning and then responding to all the points that were raised by the participants in the discussion today. Thank you all very much for staying till this late hour and sharing your views on the film. And thanks, Sam, once again for suggesting this film and also for being part of this wonderful discussion today. So thank you all and good night. See you all.
Thank you, Sam. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Tara, you promised me that you go to a barber.
But the second wave came. The second wave came after that.
Second wave, you look at me, I'm doing myself.
But I am not able to look at you.
So you are very Gandhian in that respect.
I'm doing myself, and I've been asking Tara since 2 months. It's all in a good humor. It's all in a good humor. Thank you.
No, next time if you ask, you will say third wave also.
Tara is becoming a rishi.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.